The engine coughed twice before catching, and then the propeller blurred into a silver disc. Maggiore Duilio Fanali pressed his back against the unfamiliar seat and felt the American machine tremble beneath him. It was June of 1942, and he was sitting in the cockpit of a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk at an airfield outside Tripoli. The shark mouth painted on the nose had been hastily scrubbed away, replaced with the white cross and fasces of the Regia Aeronautica, but the aircraft remained stubbornly, unmistakably American. As the RPMs climbed and the airframe shook with a violence he had never experienced in his beloved Macchi, Fanali understood that something fundamental was about to change. He had flown against these machines for months over the Libyan desert. He had cursed them, feared them, watched them fall from the sky trailing smoke. But he had never sat inside one. He had never felt its power to answer his hands. And in the minutes that followed, as he pushed the throttle forward and the Warhawk leaped into the Mediterranean sky, Maggiore Fanali would discover a truth that the propaganda ministries in Rome had worked so hard to conceal. The fighter he had been told was inferior to Italian designs was, in certain critical respects, superior to anything he had ever flown. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is a story about the collision between belief and evidence, between national pride and material reality. It is a story that unfolded not in the grand strategic conferences where generals moved armies across maps, but in the cramped cockpits and dusty hangars where individual pilots confronted the machines that would determine whether they lived or died. And it is a story that the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, would rather have forgotten because it revealed, in terms that no amount of rhetoric could, obscure, the growing gap between Axis and Allied industrial capability that would ultimately decide the war. To understand what Duilio Fanali experienced that day in Tripoli, we must first understand the world he came from, the assumptions, the training, the national mythology that shaped how Italian pilots understood their aircraft and their enemy. Because the shock of the P-40 was not simply mechanical, it was psychological. It struck at the heart of everything these men had been taught to believe about themselves, their nation, and the war they were fighting. Italy entered the Second World War in June of 1940 with an air force built on contradictions. On one hand, Italian aviation possessed a genuine tradition of excellence. The great Schneider Trophy seaplanes of the 1920s and 30s had set world speed records. Italian pilots had earned reputations for skill and daring in Ethiopia, Spain, and the skies over the Albanian mountains. The aircraft industry, led by companies like Macchi, Fiat, and Reggiane, employed talented designers who understood aerodynamics as well as anyone in Europe. On the other hand, Italy lacked the industrial capacity to translate engineering talent into mass production. The nation produced roughly 1/10 the aluminum of the United States. Its engine manufacturers struggled to develop power plants that could match the output of British and American designs. And the fascist regime, obsessed with prestige and spectacle, often prioritized appearance over substance, commissioning aircraft that looked impressive at air shows but proved fragile in combat. The result was an air force that entered the war with too few aircraft, too little fuel, and a dangerous overconfidence in Italian superiority. Pilots were told that their machines were the equal of anything they would face. They were taught that Italian courage and skill would compensate for any material shortcomings, and for a brief moment, in the early months of the North African campaign, this belief seemed justified. Italian fighters tangled with British Gladiators and Hurricanes, and held their own. The Fiat CR-42, a beautiful biplane that belonged to an earlier era of aviation, could outmaneuver almost anything it encountered. The Macchi C.200, with its radial engine and enclosed cockpit, represented a step toward modernity. Italian pilots convinced themselves that they were winning the air war through superior airmanship, but by 1941, the situation had begun to change. The British introduced the Hawker Hurricane in greater numbers, and then the American-built Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk began appearing in Royal Air Force and South African Air Force squadrons. The P-40 was not a glamorous aircraft, American pilots who flew it often complained about its limitations. It could not climb with a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It could not turn with a Japanese Zero. Its Allison engine lost power at high altitude, making it unsuitable for the post-air battles over northern Europe. But in the low-altitude, high-speed environment of the North African desert, the P-40 possessed advantages that its detractors often overlooked. It was fast in level flight. It was extremely fast in a dive. It was ruggedly built, capable of absorbing punishment that would have destroyed more delicate aircraft. And it was available rolling off American production lines in numbers that neither Italy nor Germany could match. Italian pilots began to notice these qualities in combat. The P-40 would attack from above, diving through formations with tremendous speed, firing their 6 heavy machine guns in concentrated bursts, and then extending away before the Italians could respond. When Italian fighters tried to pursue, they found themselves unable to catch the Americans in the dive. The P-40 seemed to accelerate as they descended, pulling away with an ease that defied expectation. And when Italian pilots pushed their own aircraft to follow, they encountered a phenomenon that would become grimly familiar. Their fighters began to shake, to vibrate, to threaten to come apart. The control surfaces grew heavy, the airframe protested, and prudent men pulled out of the dive rather than risk structural failure. The Americans, meanwhile, continued down and away, untouchable. This disparity was most pronounced in encounters with the Macchi C.202 Folgore, the aircraft that represented the pinnacle of Italian fighter design. The Folgore, the name meant Thunderbolt, had entered service in 1941 and was immediately recognized as the best fighter Italy had produced. It was fast, with a top speed of nearly 370 miles per hour. It was maneuverable, with light controls and excellent roll rate. It was beautiful, with graceful lines that made it one of the most aesthetically pleasing aircraft of the war. And it was powered by a license-built version of the German Daimler-Benz DB 601 engine, which gave it the power that earlier Italian fighters had lacked. Pilots who flew the Folgore loved it. They believed it was the equal of anything in the sky. But the Folgore had a weakness that its pilots were only beginning to understand. At high speeds, particularly in dives, the aircraft's performance degraded rapidly. The control surfaces, especially the ailerons, became increasingly heavy as speed increased, requiring enormous physical effort to move. At speeds above 350 miles per hour, the Folgore became difficult to maneuver. At speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, it became dangerous. The airframe, designed for different flight regimes, was approaching its structural limits. Pilots who pushed too hard risked losing control or worse, ripping the wings off entirely. The P-40, by contrast, had been designed with dive performance in mind. American engineers at Curtiss had understood that fighter combat often came down to the ability to disengage, to break off an embase, engagement and escape to fight another day. They had built the Warhawk with a heavy, robust airframe that could withstand the stresses of high-speed dives. The control surfaces remained effective at speeds that would have rendered the Folgore nearly uncontrollable. American pilots learned to exploit this advantage ruthlessly, attacking from above and diving away whenever the tactical situation demanded. They could not outclimb the Bf 109 that often flew alongside Italian formations, but they could outdive almost anything in the theatre. And against Italian fighters, this advantage proved decisive. The Regia Aeronautica was not unaware of these problems. Technical officers had been gathering data from combat reports, comparing pilot accounts, trying to understand why their aircraft were struggling against an opponent they had been told was inferior. But understanding a problem and solving it were different matters entirely. Italian industry lacked the capacity to redesign and retool for new aircraft. The production lines were already struggling to produce enough Folgores to replace losses. And the High Command, wedded to optimistic assessments and fearful of delivering bad news to Mussolini, was reluctant to acknowledge that Italian designs might be fundamentally outclassed. What was needed was direct evidence, incontrovertible proof that could cut through the fog of propaganda and institutional denial. That evidence arrived in the spring and summer of 1942, when the fortunes of war delivered several P-40 Warhawks into Italian hands. The desert was a harsh operating environment, and aircraft came down regularly, victims of mechanical failure, combat damage, navigation errors, or simple fuel exhaustion. Most crashed machines were too badly damaged to be of use, but occasionally an aircraft would make a forced landing with minimal damage, a pilot lost, out of fuel, or suffering a minor mechanical problem. These machines were prizes eagerly sought by both sides. The Germans were particularly efficient at recovering and evaluating captured Allied aircraft, and the Italians followed their example. When word reached Regia Aeronautica headquarters that intact or repairable P-40 had been recovered, orders came down immediately. Bring them to Guidonia, the Italian Air Force's research and testing facility, and find out what makes them tick. The task of evaluating the captured Warhawks fell to a select group of Italian pilots, experienced combat veterans who had flown against these aircraft and knew their own machines intimately. Among them was Maggiore Duilio Fanali, a decorated pilot with years of experience in frontline squadrons. Fanali had encountered P-40 in combat many times. He had seen them dive through his formations. He had watched his wingmen struggle to follow them. He had formed his own theories about what made the American fighter so effective in certain situations. Now he would have the chance to test those theories, himself. The evaluation process was thorough and methodical. Italian engineers swarmed over the captured aircraft, measuring, photographing, disassembling components for analysis. They were impressed by what they found and disturbed. The P-40 was not a sophisticated aircraft. Its design philosophy was straightforward, almost crude compared to the elegant lines of the Folgore. But the quality of construction was immediately apparent. The materials were excellent. The manufacturing tolerances were tight. The systems were robust and well integrated. Everything about the aircraft spoke of an industrial base that could afford to over-engineer, that had access to high-grade aluminum and steel in quantities that Italian factories could only dream of. The engine, a liquid-cooled Allison V 1710, produced over 1,000 horsepower, not exceptional by late-war standards, but delivered with a reliability that Italian engines rarely matched. The armament was devastating. 650 caliber, Browning machine guns in the wings, each capable of firing over 800 rounds per minute. Italian fighters typically carried two 12.7mm guns and two smaller caliber weapons. The weight of fire was not comparable, but the true test would come in the air. On the day of his first flight, Fanali climbed into the cockpit and immediately noticed differences from his Folgore. The American seat was more reclined, the visibility more restricted. The instruments were laid out differently, with unfamiliar gauges and switches. The controls felt different in his hands, heavier, more substantial. He went through the startup procedure, felt the big Allison cough to life, and then taxied to the runway. The takeoff run was longer than he was accustomed to. The P-40 was a heavy aircraft, and it needed distance to get airborne. But once in the air, Fanali began to understand why this machine was so respected and so feared. The first thing he noticed was the speed. In level flight at medium altitude, the P-40 was faster than his Folgore, faster than he had expected. The Allison pulled the heavy airframe through the air with relentless power. He checked his instruments, compared them to his experience in Italian aircraft, and realized that the Warhawk was outpacing anything he had flown. He climbed, and here the P-40's weakness showed itself. The climb rate was mediocre, the engine straining as altitude increased. This was consistent with what he knew: the Allison was not optimized for high-altitude performance, and the P-40 was at its worst above 20,000 feet. But Fanali had not come to test the climb. He had come to test the dive. He leveled off at 15,000 feet, checked his airspace, and pushed the nose down. The Warhawk accelerated eagerly, the Allison howling as the airspeed indicator climbed. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. Fanali gripped the stick and felt something extraordinary. The controls remained responsive. The aircraft remained stable. There was vibration, yes, and the noise was tremendous, But the Warhawk was flying as if this was exactly what it had been designed to do. He thought of his Fulgor, of the brutal stick forces he would be fighting at this speed, of the danger of compressibility and structural failure. In the P-40, he felt none of that. The American machine was diving at speeds that would have terrified him in an Italian fighter, and it was doing so with something approaching ease. He pulled out of the dive, the G-forces pressing him into the seat, and climbed back to altitude to do it again. And again. Each time, the P-40 performed flawlessly. Each time, Fanali's understanding of the aircraft and of his own Fulgor shifted a little further. He had been told that the P-40 was an inferior design, a second-rate fighter that only succeeded because of American numbers and British desperation. He had believed that Italian aircraft were technically superior, hampered only by insufficient production. Now he was sitting in the cockpit of the supposedly inferior aircraft, and it was doing things that his Fulgor could not do. The implications were staggering. When Fanali landed and climbed out of the cockpit, he was quiet. He filed his report with the Regia Aeronautica's technical branch, and that report would become part of a growing body of evidence that Italian authorities found deeply uncomfortable. Other test pilots flew the captured P-40 seconds and reached similar conclusions. The American fighter was not superior in every respect. It could not climb with the Fulgor, could not turn with it at low speed, could not match the Italian pilot's visibility or the elegance of the aircraft's handling. But in the critical matter of high-speed dive performance, the P-40 was in a different class entirely. An Italian pilot who tried to follow a diving Warhawk was taking his life in his hands. An American pilot who dived away from an attacking Fulgor was almost certain to escape. The technical reasons for this disparity were complex, rooted in engineering decisions made years before the aircraft entered combat. The Fulgor's designers had prioritized lightweight and maneuverability, producing an airframe that was agile but not robust at extreme speeds. The ailerons, in particular, were mounted on a relatively flexible wing structure that deformed under aerodynamic pressure, reducing their effectiveness. At high speeds, Italian pilots experienced a phenomenon called aileron reversal. At its approach, the controls became so heavy and ineffective that the aircraft barely responded. The P-40, by contrast, had been built with a stiffer wing and more powerful control surfaces, specifically to maintain authority in high-speed flight. American engineers had understood that a fighter's ability to dive and extend was a matter of life and death, and they had designed accordingly. But beyond the specifics of wing structure and control surface design lay a more fundamental issue, one that Italian pilots and engineers recognized, even if they could not speak of it openly. The P-40 was not an exceptional aircraft. It was a solid, workmanlike design, mass-produced by a nation that could afford to build good enough in enormous quantities. The Fulgor was a better aircraft in many respects, a more refined design that reflected the skill of Italian engineers. But Italy could not build enough of them. Italy could not supply its pilots with reliable engines, adequate spare parts, sufficient fuel and ammunition. Italy was fighting a war of industrial production with the tools of a craft economy, and the P-40 sitting on the tarmac at Guidonia was proof of what that meant. The Americans did not need to build the best fighter in the world. They just needed to build a good one, and build it by the tens of thousands. Against that, Italian excellence counted for very little. The reports from the captured P-40 evaluation program made their way through the Regia Aeronautica's bureaucracy, read by technical officers, staff planners, and eventually senior commanders. The conclusions were unmistakable and deeply troubling. Italian fighters were outclassed in high-speed performance by an aircraft that was not even considered first-rate by American standards. The gap would only widen as the Americans introduced newer designs, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang, while Italian industry struggled to move beyond the Fulgor. Some officers understood what this meant for the war. Others preferred not to think about it. The propaganda ministries continued to trumpet Italian achievements, to celebrate aerial victories, to insist that Axis powers were winning the battle for the skies. But in the quiet offices where honest assessments were made, the captured Warhawk had delivered a message that could not be ignored. For the pilots themselves, the experience was transformative. Men like Duilio Fanali returned to their squadrons with knowledge they could not fully share, understanding of their aircraft's limitations that would inform how they fought but could not be openly discussed. They developed tactics to avoid the P-40's strengths, to force engagements at low speed where the Folgore could maneuver, to deny the Americans the diving attacks they preferred. Some of these tactics were effective. Italian pilots continued to score victories throughout 1942 and into 1943, demonstrating skill and courage against growing odds. But they were fighting with an awareness that their opponent's tools were better suited to the kind of war being waged, a war of energy and speed rather than agility and grace. They had looked into the cockpit of the enemy, and they had seen the future. It was made in America, and it was coming for them in numbers they could not hope to match. The story of the captured P-40 evaluations remained largely unknown outside specialist circles for decades after the war. Italian aviation history focused on the undeniable achievements of the Regia Aeronautica, the courage of its pilots, the elegance of its aircraft, the brilliance of its designers working under impossible constraints. The uncomfortable conclusions of the Guidonia test program did not fit this narrative, and they were quietly filed away. But in recent years, historians have returned to these reports, recognizing them as crucial evidence of how the air war was actually experienced by those who fought it. The Italian pilots who flew captured P-42s were not defeatists or traitors. They were professionals trying to understand their battlefield, to give themselves and their comrades the best chance of survival. And what they learned in those cockpits was a truth that transcended national pride. That industrial capacity was becoming the decisive factor in modern warfare, and that nations which could not match American production were fighting a losing battle no matter how skilled their pilots or how refined their designs. The knowledge gained from the captured P-40 evaluations did not remain confined to the sterile reports of technical officers. It seeped into the operational squadrons through the pilots who had flown the American machine, through conversations in mess halls and briefing rooms, through the informal networks by which fighting men shared information that might save their lives. And it confirmed what many frontline pilots had already begun to suspect from their own combat experience, that the tactics which had served them well in the early months of the Desert War were becoming increasingly dangerous. The traditional Italian approach to fighter combat emphasized maneuverability, the ability to turn inside an opponent, to bring guns to bear through superior agility. This doctrine had deep roots in Italian aviation culture, stretching back to the acrobatic biplanes of the 1930s and the First World War before that. Italian pilots were trained to engage, to turn, to dogfight in the classic sense. Their aircraft were designed accordingly, with light wing loadings and responsive controls that rewarded the skilled hand. Against the early British fighters they encountered in North Africa, this approach had proven effective. The Hurricane could be outmaneuvered. The Gladiator was hopelessly outclassed. Italian pilots had won victories and built confidence in their methods, but the P-40 demanded a different response. American and Commonwealth pilots flying the Warhawk had learned to avoid turning engagements with more maneuverable opponents. Instead, they used their aircraft's speed and dive performance to control the terms of combat. They attacked from above, made one pass with all 6 guns blazing, and then dived away before the enemy could respond. If they missed, they extended at high speed, climbed back to altitude, and set up for another pass. They refused to be drawn into the turning fights where Italian pilots excelled. And when Italian fighters tried to pursue them in the dive, the disparity that Fanali and his colleagues had documented at Guidonia became lethally apparent. The P-42s pulled away, untouchable, while Italian aircraft shook themselves towards structural failure. Adapting to this reality required Italian pilots to abandon tactics that felt natural, that matched their training and their aircraft's strengths. They learned to maintain altitude, to avoid chasing diving opponents, to force engagements at lower speeds where the Folgore could maneuver. They learned to work in pairs and groups, using mutual support to compensate for individual aircraft limitations. They learned, in short, to fight defensively against an opponent they had been told was inferior a psychological adjustment as difficult as any tactical one. Pride is a powerful force, and Italian pilots had been raised on a diet of fascist rhetoric about national greatness and martial superiority. Acknowledging that their aircraft could not match the enemy in a critical performance regime meant acknowledging that something was wrong with the entire narrative they had been fed. Some pilots made this adjustment successfully, others did not. The casualty rolls of the Regia Aeronautica in 1942 and 43 contain the names of men who died because they followed a diving P-40 when they should have let it go, men whose courage and skill could not overcome the fundamental mismatch between their airframe and their opponents. Each loss represented not only a personal tragedy, but a strategic attrition that Italy could not sustain. Trained pilots were precious, and replacing them took time that the Axis did not have. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to pour men and machines into the theatre in numbers that dwarfed anything Italy could field. By the time of the Allied landings in Sicily in July of 1943, the Regia Aeronautica had been ground down to a shadow of its former strength, not because its pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they had been sent to fight an industrial war with an artisan's tools. The experience of the captured P-40 evaluations illuminated a broader truth about the air war in the Mediterranean that extended far beyond the specific question of dive performance. It revealed the extent to which combat effectiveness depended on factors that individual pilots could not control, on the quality of materials, on manufacturing precision, on the design decisions made years earlier in engineering offices far from the front. An Italian pilot might be every bit as skilled as his American or British counterpart. His aircraft might be beautifully designed and elegantly built. But if that aircraft could not survive the specific demands of combat in that theatre, if it could not dive with the enemy, could not absorb battle damage, could not be produced in sufficient numbers, then individual decay, excellence counted for very little. The war in the air, like the war on the ground and at sea, was being decided by logistics and production as much as by tactics and courage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was the lesson that the captured Warhawk taught to those Italian pilots and engineers willing to learn it. The P-40 was not a wonder weapon. It was not a technological marvel that represented some breakthrough in aeronautical science. It was a competent, mass-produced fighter that did its job reliably and could be built by the thousands. And that was precisely what made it so dangerous, not its excellence, but its adequacy combined with availability. The Americans did not need to produce masterpieces. They needed to produce enough, and enough was something that Italian industry, starved of raw materials and hobbled by inefficiency, could never achieve. The Folgore was arguably the better aircraft in a theoretical sense, a more refined design that reflected the genuine talent of Italian engineers. But there were never enough Folgores, and those that existed were often grounded for lack of spare parts, ammunition, or fuel. The P-40 kept coming, flown by pilots who had been trained in an assembly line system as efficient as the factories that built their aircraft. Quantity had a quality all its own, as the Soviets were demonstrating on the Eastern Front, and the Americans were proving in the skies over North Africa. The Italian response to this disparity was constrained by factors that no amount of pilot skill or engineering brilliance could overcome. Italian industry simply could not compete with American production. In 1942, the United States produced over 47,000 aircraft. Italy produced roughly 2,500. The ratio was nearly 20-1, and it was growing worse as American industry hit its stride while Italian factories struggled with shortages of aluminum, machine tools, and skilled labor. Even if Italy had possessed designs superior to anything the Americans could field, which, after the captured P-40 evaluations, was clearly not the case, it could not have built them in numbers that mattered. The Regia Aeronautica was fighting with one hand tied behind its back, and the rope was made of statistics that no amount of heroism could cut. Engineers at companies like Macchi, Fiat, and Reggiane understood these limitations and worked desperately to improve their designs within the constraints they faced. The Macchi C.205 Veltro which began reaching squadrons in early 1943, represented a significant advance over the Folgore, faster, more powerful, better armed, with improved high-speed handling that addressed some of the deficiencies revealed by the P-40 evaluations. Italian pilots who flew the Veltro considered it superb, capable of meeting even the latest Allied fighters on equal terms. But the C.205 arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. By the time it entered service, the Allies had achieved air superiority over the Mediterranean that would never be seriously challenged. The handful of Veltros that reached the front were drops of excellence in an ocean of Allied quantity. They scored victories, demonstrated what Italian aviation could achieve, and then were overwhelmed along with everything else. The story of the captured P-40 evaluation program thus becomes a window into the larger tragedy of the Italian war effort, a story of genuine capability undermined by impossible circumstances, of individual excellence rendered irrelevant by systemic failure. The Italian pilots who flew those American fighters at Guidonia were not fools or cowards. They were professionals who wanted to understand their enemy and improve their own chances of survival. What they learned was that the war they were fighting could not be won with the tools they had been given, that the gap between Axis and Allied capability was growing wider with every month, and that no amount of courage or skill could bridge it. This was knowledge that could not be spoken openly in fascist Italy, where defeatism was treason and criticism of the war effort could mean imprisonment or worse. But it was knowledge that shaped how these men fought, how they led their squadrons, how they understood their place in a conflict that was slipping away from them. For Maggiore, Duilio Fanali, and the other pilots who participated in the evaluation program, the experience marked a turning point in their understanding of the war. They continued to fly, to fight, to do their duty as they understood it. Some survived the war, others did not. But none of them could forget what they had learned in the cockpit of that captured Warhawk, the way it dived without protest, the way it held together at speeds that would have torn their own aircraft apart, the way it embodied an industrial philosophy that their nation could not match. They had seen the future in that airplane, and the future belonged to the Allies. The armistice between Italy and the Allies came in September of 1943, and with it, the Regia Aeronautica effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Some pilots joined the new Italian co-belligerent air force and flew alongside the Allies against Germany. Others joined the fascist rump state in the north and continued fighting for the Axis. Most simply went home, exhausted and disillusioned, to wait out the rest of the war in a country torn apart by occupation and civil conflict. The captured P-42s at Guidonia were eventually lost, destroyed, scrapped, or absorbed into the chaos of the Italian collapse. The reports generated by the evaluation program survived in archives, read by historians decades later, as evidence of a moment when hard truths broke through the fog of propaganda and wishful thinking. What those reports reveal is not a story of Italian failure, but of Italian clarity, the willingness of professional military men to assess their situation honestly, even when honesty was dangerous. The pilots who flew the captured Warhawks did not want to believe that their aircraft were outclassed. They did not want to report conclusions that reflected badly on Italian industry and design. But they were honest men, and they reported what they found. The P-40 could outdive the Folgore. The P-40's controls remained effective at speeds that rendered Italian aircraft nearly unmanageable. The P-40 embodied a design philosophy, rugged, practical, mass-producible, that was winning the war. These were not conclusions that the fascist regime wanted to hear, but they were conclusions that the Regia Aeronautica needed to understand if it was to have any chance of adapting to the reality of the air war. That adaptation came too late to matter. By the time the lessons of the captured P-40 evaluations could be incorporated into new designs and new tactics, Italy was out of the war as an Axis power. The Macchi C.200 and the Fiat G.55, both of which represented significant improvements in high-speed performance, arrived in numbers too small to affect anything. The pilots who had learned so much about their enemy's capabilities never got the chance to apply that knowledge on equal terms. They fought with what they had, which was never enough, and they paid the price that inadequate tools always exact from the men who must use them. But the story of the captured P-40 evaluations endures because it speaks to something larger than the specific circumstances of the Mediterranean Air War. It speaks to the relationship between technology and doctrine, between industrial capacity and military effectiveness, between national mythology and operational reality. The Italian pilots who flew those American fighters were confronting questions that every military force must eventually face. Are our weapons adequate to the task? Are our tactics suited to the tools we have? Are we seeing the battlefield clearly, or are we blinded by what we want to believe? These are not comfortable questions, and the answers are not always what we hope. But asking them honestly is the beginning of wisdom, and the Italian evaluation of the captured P-40 was, at its heart, an exercise in uncomfortable honesty. The P-40 Warhawk was never considered a great fighter by those who designed and built it. American pilots who flew it often wished for something better, something that could climb like a Messerschmitt, turn like a Zero, perform at high altitude like a Spitfire. The aircraft was a compromise, a design that did nothing brilliantly but did many things well enough. It was rugged, where more refined aircraft were fragile. It was fast in the dive, where more maneuverable aircraft were sluggish. It was available where more advanced designs were scarce. And in the low-altitude, high-speed environment of the North African desert, these qualities made it formidable. Italian pilots who flew against it learned to respect it. Italian pilots who flew it learned to understand why. The shark mouth on the nose was not just decoration, it was a warning. This aircraft bites. The men who conducted the captured P-40 evaluation program served their country by telling it truths it did not want to hear. They measured the enemy's aircraft with precision and reported their findings without false comfort. They gave the Regia Aeronautica information that could have informed better tactics, better training, better allocation of resources if the circumstances had allowed such adaptation. That the circumstances did not, that Italy's industrial and strategic position was already beyond recovery, does not diminish the value of what they did. They were professionals doing professional work in a time of crisis, and their honesty deserves recognition even if their efforts could not change the outcome. For the Regia Aeronautica, the captured P-40 evaluations were a mirror held up to reality, a reflection that showed the gap between propaganda and truth, between what pilots were told about their aircraft and what those aircraft could actually do. Looking into that mirror required courage, perhaps as much courage as flying into combat, and what the Italians saw there was the shape of things to come. An industrial war in which production and logistics would matter as much as courage and skill, in which adequate in quantity would defeat excellence in scarcity, in which the nation that could build more would ultimately prevail. This was the future that Maggiore Fanali glimpsed when he pushed that Warhawk into a dive and felt it hold together at speeds that would have shaken his Folgore apart. It was a future made in American factories, delivered in American ships, flown by American pilots, and it was coming for Italy whether Italy was ready or not. The story ends, as all such stories must, with the passage of time and the fading of memory. The pilots who flew the captured P-40 grew old, if they survived the war. The aircraft themselves were scrapped or lost. The reports gathered dust in archives, consulted occasionally by historians seeking to understand the technical dimensions of the air war. But the lesson remains, as relevant now as it was in 1942, that honest assessment of capability is the foundation of effective military practice, that self-deception is the enemy of adaptation, and that the courage to see clearly is as important as the courage to fight bravely. The Italian pilots who evaluated those captured Warhawks possessed both kinds of courage. They flew against the odds, fought with inferior tools, and told the truth about what they found. They deserved better than the war they were given. But they faced it with open eyes, and that is something worth remembering. In the end, the P-40 Warhawk that sat on the tarmac at Guidonia was more than an enemy aircraft to be studied. It was a message from the future, written in aluminum and steel, delivered by the tides of war. The message said that the world was changing, that the old ways of building and fighting were being swept away by industrial modernity, that nations which could not adapt would be left behind. Italy received that message, understood it, and could not respond. The pilots who flew the captured Warhawk carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. The memory of an aircraft that did what their own could not, that represented a way of war they could not match, that showed them the face of their defeat before the defeat itself arrived. They were brave men who deserved the truth, and the truth was what the P-40 gave them. It was not a gift they wanted, but it was one they needed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.